Why Halloween was better in the UK in the 1980s isn't just nostalgia talking. It's about when October 31st meant something fundamentally different. Children made their own costumes, carved unconventional vegetables so hard they needed parental supervision, and wore masks so terrifying they'd give health officers a breakdown. Here's what most don't realise. 1980s. British Halloween was the last gasp of authentic Celtic tradition before American commercialisation swept it away. However, what we lost in authenticity, we're told we gained in safety and fun. But did we? What happened to British Halloween reveals something profound about how we've sanitised childhood itself. Let's start with something that'll make you wince just thinking about it. Turnips. Yes, those rock-hard, smelly root vegetables that your gran insisted were good for you. In the 1980s, particularly in Scotland and parts of northern England, children weren't carving pumpkins for Halloween. They were hacking away at neeps. And if you've never tried to carve a turnip, you've genuinely missed out on one of childhood's most frustrating rites of passage. The tradition of carving turnips goes back centuries in Britain and Ireland, long before pumpkins were even a twinkle in Halloween's eye. The original jack-o'-lanterns were turnips, hollowed out and carved with grotesque faces, with a candle placed inside to ward off evil spirits. This wasn't some quaint craft activity, this was serious work. Turnips are dense, fibrous, and smell absolutely awful when you start cutting into them. The smell alone could clear a room. It was like a combination of cabbage, dirt, and something vaguely sulphurous that would cling to your clothes for days. Children in the 80s would sit at kitchen tables with proper kitchen knives, not child-safe plastic implements, carefully carving away at these vegetables under watchful parental eyes. The results were often wonky, asymmetrical, and absolutely terrifying in a way that perfectly round, symmetrical pumpkins could never match. There was something genuinely eerie about a gnarled turnip lantern with its flickering candlelight casting shadows through uneven eye holes. The switch to pumpkins was happening gradually throughout the 1980s, driven by American cultural influence through television and films. Supermarkets started stocking pumpkins, though they were considerably more expensive than turnips. Many families stuck with tradition, partly out of preference and partly out of economy. A turnip cost pennies, a pumpkin could cost several pounds, which was significant money in the 80s when a loaf of bread was about 36 pence. What's fascinating is how quickly the turnip tradition disappeared. By the mid-1990s, you'd be hard-pressed to find a child who'd ever carved a turnip. It became one of those things that grandparents would mention and kids would look at them like they were describing Victorian workhouses. But here's the controversial bit. Those turnip lanterns were objectively more authentic, more connected to British and Celtic heritage, and, frankly, more terrifying than any shop-bought pumpkin could ever be. The turnip represented something deeper about 80s Halloween. It was harder, it required actual skill and patience, and it couldn't be mass-produced or commercialised. You couldn't buy a pre-carved turnip from Tesco. It was resolutely handmade, personal, and a little bit dangerous. That's something we've lost. Now, before we dive into the masks that gave an entire generation nightmares, let me just say this. What's coming up later in this video about community trick-or-treating in the 80s is going to hit you right in the nostalgia. We're talking about a time when entire streets would participate, doors would actually open, and children could roam in ways that would make modern parents break out in cold sweats. But more on that later. First, let's talk about those masks. If you were a child in 1980s, Britain, you'll remember the masks. Not cute licensed character masks kids wear today. I'm talking about those horrible cheap rubber masks that smelled like a chemical factory and made you sweat so profusely you'd emerge looking like you'd been bobbing for apples with your entire head. These masks were something else entirely, usually generic old man or witch designs, made from thin rubber that would tear if you looked at it wrong, with tiny eye holes that meant you could barely see where you were going, and elastic that would either be too tight and give you a headache, or too loose and have the mask sliding off your face at the worst possible moment. The most popular was what we simply called the old man mask. You know the one. Wrinkled face, often with a long nose, sometimes with attached scraggly grey hair made from what felt like steel wool, and a permanently surprised or angry expression moulded into the rubber. These masks were genuinely disturbing. They occupied an uncanny valley between human and not quite human that was far more unsettling than any modern horror film prosthetic. You could buy these masks from Woolworths, corner shops, or market stalls for about £2 or £3, which represented serious pocket money in the 80s. They came in plastic bags, and the smell when you opened them was distinctive, a mix of rubber, plastic, and some chemical compound that probably wouldn't pass safety standards today. Within minutes of wearing one, your face would be drenched in sweat, condensation would form on the inside, and breathing became a conscious effort. But here's the thing, these masks were terrifying in a way that modern Halloween masks simply aren't. There was something deeply uncanny about seeing your mate transformed into a creepy old man. The cheap production quality actually added to the horror. The wrinkles were too deep, the skin tone was never quite right, usually a sickly grey or an unnatural pink, and the fixed expression created an unsettling effect that no amount of money could replicate today. The other popular variant was the witch mask. Green skin, hooked nose with a wart, and stringy black hair. These weren't cute witch costumes. These were nightmare fuel. Children wearing these masks would chase each other around streets, and the fear they inspired was genuine. The health and safety implications would make modern regulators faint. The vision was terrible, encouraging children to stumble and trip. The breathing restrictions were significant, the materials were untested for skin sensitivity, and yet an entire generation survived, most of us without incident. Perhaps we were just tougher, or perhaps we were lucky. Either way, those masks remain seared into the memory of anyone who wore one. Uncomfortable, smelly, vision impairing, and absolutely brilliant. This leads us beautifully into the broader world of 80s Halloween costumes, which were, to put it mildly, absolutely terrible. And I mean that in the most affectionate way possible. There was no popping onto Amazon and ordering a high-quality costume with next-day delivery. If you wanted a Halloween costume in the 80s, you had three options. Make it yourself, cobble it together from clothes you already owned, or buy one of the flimsy packaged costumes from Woolworths that would tear before you even got it out of the house. The homemade costume was an art form born out of necessity and limited resources. Mothers, let's be honest, it was usually mothers, would create costumes from bin bags, old sheets, face paint, and whatever else was lying around the house. The bin bag was absolutely the MVP of 80s Halloween. A black bin bag could become a witch's dress, a bat, or general spooky attire with minimal effort. Just cut holes for head and arms, maybe add some cardboard wings, and you were done. Ghost costumes were even simpler. Old white sheet, cut 2 holes for eyes, done. Never mind that you couldn't see properly and would trip over the trailing edges. You were a ghost, and that was that. Some enterprising souls would add chains from the shed to be the ghost of Jacob Marley, showing that even in the 80s, Dickens still had cultural relevance. Witches were popular because they were easy. Black clothes, a broomstick from the kitchen, and a homemade pointy hat made from black card. The hat would inevitably be too big, too small, or would collapse within an hour, but that was part of the charm. Face paint was used liberally, usually the cheap kind that would stain your skin green for days. Vampires required black clothes and a cape, which meant an old black curtain or tablecloth pinned around your neck with a safety pin. Add some white face paint and red around the mouth, and you were Dracula. The cape would come unpinned approximately 17 times during the evening, but that was expected. Here's what's genuinely fascinating. These terrible homemade costumes required creativity, problem-solving, and resourcefulness. Children and parents had to think about what made something recognizable, then work out how to achieve that with limited materials. It was craft, it was art, and it was genuinely educational, even if nobody realized it at the time. The shop-bought alternatives weren't much better. If you were lucky enough to have parents who'd spend money on a proper costume, you'd get one of those plastic affairs that came in a box. A thin plastic smock with a picture of a skeleton or monster printed on it, and a plastic mask. These costumes cost about £5 to £10, which was serious money. The plastic smock would rustle with every movement, and the whole thing would split if you moved too enthusiastically. Now let's talk about what really shaped Halloween in the 1980s. The films. The 80s was an absolute golden age for horror, fantasy, and supernatural cinema. And these films had an enormous impact on how children approached Halloween, even if their costumes didn't always reflect it due to the limitations we've just discussed. The decade opened with The Shining in 1980, which absolutely terrified a generation. While young children weren't watching it officially, older siblings and teenagers were, and the cultural impact was enormous. Images from that film became part of Halloween vocabulary, but it was the more family-friendly supernatural films that really shaped children's Halloween experience. E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982 featured one of the most iconic Halloween scenes in cinema history. With Elliot and E.T. trick-or-treating together, E.T. disguised as a ghost. That scene showed British children how American Halloween worked: costumes, pumpkins, going door to door in residential neighbourhoods. It was aspirational and exciting. Gremlins in 1984 was another game changer. Here was a film that was simultaneously adorable and terrifying, with creatures that were cute until they were fed after midnight, then became chaos incarnate. Gizmo became a popular reference point, even if actually making a Mogwai costume was beyond most people's capabilities. Ghostbusters, also 1984, was absolutely massive in Britain. The theme song was everywhere, the logo was instantly recognisable, and suddenly every child wanted to be a Ghostbuster for Halloween. The problem was making the costume. The proton pack alone was an engineering challenge that defeated most parents. Some ambitious souls would create cardboard and tin foil versions, but they rarely lasted the evening. The Lost Boys in 1987 brought vampires back into fashion, but these were cool, leather-clad vampires, not the Dracula in evening dress of previous generations. It influenced how teenagers approached Halloween, making it less about childish trick-or-treating and more about style and attitude. British television also played its part. Shows like Children of the Stones, which had aired in 1977 but was repeated throughout the early 80s, created a uniquely British sense of supernatural dread. Doctor Who, particularly the Tom Baker and Peter Davison years, provided regular doses of child-appropriate scares that were perfect for the Halloween season. These films and shows created a shared cultural vocabulary around Halloween, giving children ideas and inspiration even when the reality of costume making couldn't quite match the ambition. They made Halloween feel bigger, more cinematic, and more exciting than ever before. We're about halfway through now, and I hope you're enjoying this trip down memory lane. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep watching till the end. Here's the controversial bit, the part that'll probably get me comments calling me irresponsible. 80s. Halloween was better precisely because it was less safe, less supervised, and less sanitized. Now, before you click away in disgust, hear me out. The 1980s saw the tail end of what was called free-range childhood in Britain. Children as young as 7 or 8 would go out trick-or-treating without parental supervision, roaming streets in small groups, knocking on doors, staying out until 9 or 10 at night. This would be considered borderline neglectful by today's standards, but it was absolutely normal in the 80s. Were there risks? Absolutely. But here's what's rarely discussed. The actual statistical risk to children hasn't changed dramatically. What's changed is our perception of risk, amplified by 24-hour news media and social media. The 80s weren't objectively safer, we were just less aware of dangers, and paradoxically, that made childhood feel more expansive. Halloween in the 80s had an edge of genuine danger that made it exciting. You were out after dark, you were approaching strangers' homes, you were navigating unfamiliar territory, and you were doing it without constant adult supervision. That frisson of genuine fear, of actual risk, however small, made Halloween feel important and thrilling. Modern Halloween, with its organised parties, adult supervision, and risk-assessed activities, is objectively safer, but subjectively less exciting. There's also the uncomfortable truth that modern Halloween has become massively commercialised and Americanised in a way that erodes British cultural traditions. The turnips are gone, replaced by pumpkins. The homemade costumes are gone, replaced by expensive, licensed character outfits. The community aspect is diminished, replaced by organised events. We've traded authenticity for safety, spontaneity for structure, and genuine childhood independence for adult-managed experiences. This isn't to say modern Halloween is bad, it's different, safer, more inclusive, better organised. But it's worth acknowledging what's been lost in that transition, and the 80s represent that tipping point, the last decade before the full commercialisation and sanitisation of Halloween took hold. Community spirit and the lost art of neighbourhood. Halloween. Halloween in 1980s. Britain was genuinely communal in a way that's increasingly rare today. Entire streets participated. Most houses expected trick-or-treaters and had sweets ready. There was an unspoken social contract. Children would knock, perform entertainment, and receive treats in return. The tradition of guising, particularly strong in Scotland but present throughout Britain, was fundamentally different from American trick-or-treating. You had to earn your treats by singing, telling jokes, or performing tricks. This created actual interaction between children and adults, meaningful community engagement that's been lost. Neighbourhoods were more settled. People lived in the same house for decades, knew their neighbours, and there was genuine cohesion. Mrs. Smith at number 42 would be handing out sweets. Mr. Jones at number 17 was always good for chocolate bars. Everyone knew which houses to avoid. The freedom children had was extraordinary by today's standards. Groups of kids would range across multiple streets, navigating by streetlight and local knowledge. They'd return home with bags heavy with sweets, exhausted and exhilarated. Parents would check the hall for anything suspicious but generally trusted the community. What's really changed is community structure itself. We're more isolated now, less connected to neighbours, less likely to answer doors to unknown children. Letting young children go alone would be unthinkable today, but it was routine in the 80s. Streets would be alive on Halloween night. You'd hear excited kids before you saw them, moving house to house, comparing halls, daring each other to knock on the scary house at the end of the street. The social rules were clearer. Don't go before dark. Stop by 9 p.m. Respect houses with no lights. Say please and thank you. The morning after, children at school would compare halls, trading sweets they didn't like, still buzzing with excitement. Teachers tolerated the tiredness, understanding this was just how it was after Halloween. The late 1980s marked Halloween's turning point. American influence surged through television and film. Supermarkets expanded Halloween displays. The modern commercial Halloween was emerging. But in the 80s, we still operated on the old model, homemade, community-based, authentically rooted in Celtic traditions. What's happened since is complete transformation. Pumpkins replaced turnips. Trick-or-treating became organised. Costumes shifted from handmade to shop-bought. Parental supervision became universal. Community events replaced spontaneous street adventures. So why was 80s Halloween better? Not the costume quality, terrible. Safety standards, questionable. Or organisation, non-existent. It was better because it was authentic, community-based and genuinely exciting in ways contemporary Halloween struggles to match. For those who experienced it, these memories remain vivid. The turnip smell, the mask sweat, the thrill of dark streets, and the feeling that Halloween was genuinely special, slightly dangerous, and entirely ours. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, if you remember carving turnips and wearing those awful masks, if you missed the Halloween of the 1980s, then hit that subscribe button. There's more nostalgia, more controversial takes on how things were better back then, and more honest discussions about what we've gained and lost as society has changed. Ring the bell for notifications because trust me, Mayor, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay spooky, stay nostalgic, and remember, sometimes terrible homemade costumes and questionable safety standards make for the best memories.